We were shocked, but we were not surprised when the draft Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe v. Wade was leaked. We were shocked because access to safe and legal abortions has been a protected constitutional right for nearly 50 years. And this reversal is, well, it's horrifying. It's obviously unjust in so very many ways. But none of us could really say that it's surprising because this has been part of almost every national elections campaign conversation for decades. We can hardly be surprised, especially after the Trump administration's appointments, which were clearly orchestrated in order to achieve this specific result. I was out of the country when news of the leak broke, but I immediately contacted David to say, we're going to have to juggle our preaching schedule to make a response to this nightmare sooner rather than later. My mind raced back to all the arguments we have made about this topic. For years, I was around before Roe v. Wade promoting these arguments that every woman has a right to manage her own reproductive health, in consultation with a physician, of course, but certainly without the interference of the government. And all of the well-rehearsed arguments about the hypocrisy of being concerned about bringing a child to term, but not being concerned about the child's housing, nutrition, education, health care. There's so much to be said about the basic human rights of a woman to make this decision on her own. And yet, I just don't think I want to allow myself to be dragged into that debate. If you will indulge me an aside, I think it's a relevant aside at this point. I spent the first 20 years that I was a pastor in Springfield, Missouri, fighting for the civil rights of the LGBT community. I was, in many ways, in the 90s and the first part of this century, a lone voice in this religious wilderness in southern Missouri for many, many of those years. I've lived through having protesters marching up and down the front of my church, repeated threats to either fire me from the congregation or more extreme anonymous physical threats, including many death threats. A retired minister in that denominational church was so outraged by what I was doing that he actually scouted around and found enough money to hire a private investigator to look into my personal life to try to find enough dirt on me to end my career. I believe that he actually charged this private investigator to go out and find my gay lover because the guy who hired him had no capacity for understanding compassion. He assumed that if I was risking my career and my safety fighting for gay rights, that I must secretly be gay myself. And that poor private detective spent 8 months going through my garbage and listening to my phone calls without being able to find that secret bit of knowledge that they paid so much money to find. But I do believe that my engagement in that fight, along with several other controversial ethical issues, is what finally brought about the end of my relationship with my former denomination, which is a price that I would gladly pay all over again if I had to relive those years. But about a decade ago, before the 2015 Supreme Court decision that made same-sex marriage legal, we were hosting a conference with the late Bishop John Shelby Spong, and he said something in one of his talks that was life-changing and liberating for me. Bishop Spong said in one of his talks that he was through trying to explain his biblical and moral defense of gay rights to those who continued to oppose same-sex marriage. He said that having thoroughly explained his beliefs repeatedly for decades, that it was now the turn of the opponents of gay rights to make some plausible defense of their prejudice. I don't think he could have been more on target, and I personally felt like a weight had been taken off of my shoulders. I realized that it is not my job to convince the homophobic to overcome their prejudices. I am not, after all, the asshole whisperer. They've already been told everything they need to be told. And if they're still choosing the prejudice, then it's on them. For decades, we have paid the price, we liberals. We've lost church members, we've lost church jobs, we've lost friends, we've lost even some family members because we were carrying the banner for gay rights. But we have nothing new to add to the debate. Now it's time for those who seek to maintain this wretched prejudice to explain themselves. And we all know there is no credible explanation. I say all that because I believe we're now at the exact same place with the civil rights of women, especially as it regards their right to manage their own reproductive lives. It isn't that Justices Thomas, Alito, Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, and Barrett don't understand the issues at hand. It is that they do not care. It's no longer our job to convince them to start doing the right thing. They've made it abundantly clear that they have no interest in doing the right thing, even though they know what is right. It is now our job to double down and change our government so that such an injustice cannot stand. And people with such tortured moral retardation as Thomas, Alito, Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, and Barrett are not ever again appointed to a powerful decision-making position. In the United States, national elections are always won in the margins. The largest margin that any president has won in my lifetime was the 23% that was won when Richard Nixon ran for re-election. And Richard Nixon had to resign in disgrace. No one in the last 30 years has won by even a 10% margin. We elect presidents and most senators by very slim margins of 1, 2, 3, maybe 4%. And if someone gets 4%, they will call it a landslide and claim to have a mandate. Because of this almost even 50-50 divide in American politics, both parties have to try to add up which constituencies they have to add to their voting base in order to win an election. Both parties have tried to use redistricting to maximize their reliable voting blocks and minimize the value of the votes of their opponents. Now, granted, the Republican Party has elevated redistricting and voter suppression to the level of a racist sacrament, but they know that immigrants, minorities, and most of the poor tend to vote heavily for Democrats. And so in a fit of anti-democratic manipulation, they are trying to suppress the votes of almost all minorities because if they don't, Republicans can never win a national election. Now, there was a time when Catholics and evangelicals tended to vote for Democrats because their constituency is largely drawn from the working poor. But in the most recent generations, Republicans have used abortion as the issue that they could exploit to lure Catholic and evangelical voters. Even though between 70 and 80% of Americans are in favor of a woman's right to choose in almost every case, the Republican Party has wrapped itself in several unpopular positions in order to garner the vote of single-issue voters. Abortion is one of those. Obviously, gun ownership is another. And when those fail, they'll trot out scare words like socialism or whine about the liberal media to herd enough of the lunatic fringe into their pro-business, pro-military voting blocs to win some elections. You will note that in the wake of this horrible mass murder in Baltimore, that Republican elected officials have been almost entirely silent. Now, it isn't more than 3 or 4 of them who could be dumb enough to have ever actually believed in this whole notion about white people being replaced by Jews or blacks, Latinos or Arabs. But here's the crux of the matter. No Republican can win an election in this century without the votes of the racist voting bloc, the people who believe in conspiracy theories. So they can't even breathe near a microphone right now, lest they lose the vote of racist lunatics. This is a hard reality of our current voter demographics. Now, I could be wrong, but I don't believe that Ronald Reagan or either of the Bushes, nor even Donald Trump for that matter, were actually personally opposed to a woman's right to choose. For that matter, I don't think they were really opposed to gay rights, nor would they, in their heart of hearts, defended the right of a deranged 18-year-old nut to buy an AR-15 military weapon. But they acted like they were anti-abortion, pro-assault rifle, and anti-same-sex marriage in order to court the votes of the fanatical fringe. The thing is, most of us realized, at least so far as Reagan and the Bushes were concerned, this was nothing but performative politics. They had no intention of actually doing anything to overturn Roe. They were just throwing out enough red meat to keep their fringe voting blocs in their camp. Not horribly unlike the way that many Democrats have feigned interest in matters of concern to black and brown voters only long enough to win an election, and then they go back to work full-time for their political donors. I wish I was just being cynical about politics, but if I were to invite you to prove me wrong, what evidence could you dig up to suggest that what I've just said is not entirely true? Abortion has been a part of performative politics for years. Some states have managed to nibble away at the edges of abortion rights, often passing laws that they knew had no chance of standing up to review in the Supreme Court, but they passed them to make it look like they were taking the issue seriously. But after decades of promises and fake gestures, the chickens have come home to roost. It's similar to the way Putin has threatened to use nuclear weapons on the battlefield in Ukraine. He knows that he would have to be completely insane to do it, and if he did, it could bring about the end of Russia's existence. But if you threaten it enough, you may very well wake up one day and find that it is your only option, and you either do it or lose. We are right now in greater danger of global nuclear war than at any other time in the last 50 years. And it's almost entirely because of the lust for power on the part of one man. In the United States, we are about to lose the protections of Roe v. Wade because of the lust for power in one political party. Many years ago, I had a young woman in my congregation who was so angry at a boyfriend who had broken up with her that she started stalking him. She would break into his house, and finally, she started making suicidal gestures to get his attention. At some point, she called him, saying that she was in her garage with her car running, and she was calling to say goodbye, and he just called the police. And the police broke in and took her to a mental hospital. I went to visit her there, and she said something to me that was very profound that I've never forgotten. She said, "I have learned that if you act crazy long enough, people will start to treat you like you're crazy." Now, not that the Democratic Party hasn't broken my heart many times, and it's not that insincerity and incompetence are litmus tests to become a Republican candidate, but folks, what I'm saying is that the Republican Party has acted crazy long enough. It is time for us to start treating them like they're crazy. I'm not saying that we need to lock them away and never hear from them again. At least I don't think I'm saying that. I believe that we must have at least 2 viable political parties. Honestly, I wish that we had 4 or 5 and not just 2, but we have to have at least 2. I just don't think that what the Republican Party has become can be one of them. who they are today is not viable in a democracy. Nobody needs crazy at this level. The quote is attributed to several different people, but I like to think it really was Mark Twain who said that all political parties eventually die choking on their own lies. Now, it's been more than a century since one of our leading parties in the United States has died, leaving room for a new party to take its place. But please consider today's sermon to be my eulogy for the Republican Party. They no longer have a defensible place in American politics. We have room for a conservative party if they're conservative about economics and business practices and defense and immigration, but we don't have room for racism. These murders in the last week show that for a fact. We don't have room for misogyny or homophobia, and we sure don't have room for protecting the kind of access to guns that we have only in the United States. Overturning Roe v. Wade will allow abortion laws to revert to the states. And folks, no state should be able to take away anyone's civil rights. We wouldn't leave freedom of speech or freedom of religion up to the states. If we did, what state in the Midwest would it be legal for this church to continue to exist? That's why the Constitution went to print originally with a Bill of Rights as its first 10 amendments. Some things are beyond being revoked simply by popular vote. There are lots of people on the lunatic right who not only want to deport all of the brown people if they could, they would also deport all the liberals if it was possible. And sure, a lot of us talk about self-deportation, but I still want it to be my choice when I disappear to a tropical island, never to be seen again. But folks, we have to know it won't stop at being a state-by-state option. There is already talk of passing a nationwide ban on all abortions, and it wouldn't stop there either. Thomas and Alito voted against the 2015 decision to legalize same-sex marriage. Now that there's a bulletproof majority of right-wing fanatics on the Supreme Court, how long do you think it would be before they overturn the decision to allow for gay marriage? They might even go after birth control. They could go after interracial marriage. What is safe from the Christian Taliban in 2020? That may seem crazy, but a couple of years ago, a lot of people thought that the fear of overturning Roe was crazy, and now we see that crazy has come to town. I would remind you that the last 3 conservative judges all said in their Senate hearings that they considered Roe to be settled law, even calling on the legal concept of stare decisis to imply that we should always allow past decisions to stand. Now, I don't know who believed them in those Senate hearings when they were offering those assurances, but they looked the senators in the eye and leaned into the microphone and lied like a cheap rug. Senator Susan Collins assured journalists that she was absolutely confident that Gorsuch and Kavanaugh would not overturn Roe before she voted for their confirmation. If she was, I suspect that she was the only sentient creature in Washington, D.C., a possibly small crowd at best, who actually believed them. After this draft was leaked, she told the press, if this leaked draft opinion is the final decision and this reporting is accurate, it would be completely inconsistent with what Justice Gorsuch and Justice Kavanaugh said in their hearings and in their meetings in my office, which, to quote pop singer Billie Eilish, duh. I don't want to be trite about politicians lying. Politicians will say whatever they have to say to get elected. I had a guy running for city council in my little hometown of Glasgow, Kentucky, who promised voters in 1972, if elected to Glasgow City Council, that he would bring our boys home from Vietnam. I was too young to vote, but I sure was in favor of bringing our boys home from Vietnam before I had to go join them. Not that the City Council of Glasgow, Kentucky had much to say about it. An unscrupulous jurist will say anything they have to say to be granted a seat on the Supreme Court. We would like to think that people at that level would be honest, but we have seen them lie and lie and lie. In 1991, Clarence Thomas just dodged the question of Roe v. Wade by saying that he hadn't given it much thought. An adult Catholic federal judge who claimed that he had not given much thought to the most famous Supreme Court decision since Plessy versus Ferguson. You might legitimately wonder what they're doing being considered for a position on the High Court if they haven't really thought about the law. But we know he was also lying. He knew what he thought about Roe, and he has been waiting for 30 years to be in a majority of justices so that he could cast this vote. May not be relevant to this discussion, but when I knew that Biden was going to appoint a black woman to the court, I desperately wished that he would pick Anita Hill. I don't have a sadistic streak in me, but I do have a certain lust for justice, especially when it's been denied for 30 years. I did my master's work in the treatment of addiction, and 40 years ago, the best program of recovery that I could study was AA and Al-Anon. And I can tell you, all these decades later, I am still grateful for every evening that I spent in the smoke-filled basement of some church somewhere attending those meetings, because I learned more in AA and Al-Anon than I learned in any class I ever took at Vanderbilt or Harvard. Now, AA is obviously the meeting for recovering alcoholics. Al-Anon was for the family members of those alcoholics who needed to learn that they could not make their spouse become, or their father become sober. The addict's recovery is up to the addict. But they did need to learn how to not be an enabler who made addiction possible. And one of the most important pieces of advice given to those people in Al-Anon meetings was to stop acting like they believed the addict's lies. Drug addicts and alcoholics invented gaslighting. Of course I didn't steal any money out of your purse. I can't believe you would accuse me of such a dastardly act. You must go to confess to our priest right now. Stop believing the lies. Stop acting like you believe them, Susan Collins. You know you didn't. The mistake that I made in grad school was thinking of people lying to get what they wanted was somehow unique to addiction. It's not. It's not even unique to politicians, but it is an aspect of being a sociopath. And men and women, we have to stop electing sociopaths to national office or appointing them to Supreme Court seats. You used to hear the saying that a woman voting for a Republican was like a chicken voting for Colonel Sanders. But what if you're not a woman? What if you, say, have a sister, or a daughter, or a mother? Or maybe you just believe in justice for women, even if you don't have a specific woman in your life to defend. Maybe you just care about justice. Voting for someone like Donald Trump does not make you a racist, a homophobe, a xenophobe, or a misogynist, but it does mean that you're okay with racism, that you're okay with taking away the rights of gays and lesbians and the transgendered, that it's not a deal breaker for you. And all those kids in cages on the border, that's just law enforcement, those darn little criminals wanting to eat and all that. The women who went out and marched the day after Trump's inauguration knew what they were talking about. It did matter. Sure, Trump's an idiot, but he has appointed dangerous ideologues to the Supreme Court, and we're going to be fighting those sociopaths for the rest of our lives. I wish that the United States had a real Green Party. I wish we had a legitimate Labor Party. Heck, you know me, I wish we had a really intelligent Democratic Socialist Party. But people as long as it is possible for a party to get someone like Mitch McConnell or Donald Trump elected to positions of leadership, that party has to go. I can only beg you to stop buying ammunition for your own assassins. And that's what you're doing when you vote for a sociopath. Voting is now our only means of changing our government into a more compassionate and intelligent government. I'd like to remind you, in closing, of the insights of one of our nation's most insightful founders, Thomas Paine, who said, "To argue with a person who has renounced the use of reason is like administering medicine to the dead." The Republican Party has abandoned American democracy in favor of a form of kleptocratic fascism. And as such, it simply is not a viable option for American voters, in much the same way that Fox is not really a news station, precious moment statues are not really art, and though my daughter and I still do not agree, the Spice Girls were never musicians. But of course, that's just my opinion. I could be wrong.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.